3, 2, 1.
Welcome to another AQR Literary Hour. We decided to extend our 40th anniversary benefit series through another year, and we're halfway through, because it's just so inspiring to hear Alaska Quarterly Review contributors read their work and chat a bit. You can find the recordings of previous programs at our website at aqreview.org and our YouTube channel. Today we have three terrific writers, all masters of the short story, that we're fortunate to share the next hour with: Anjali Sachdeva, Katherine Heine, and Maria Adelman. Welcome. I'm Heather Lindy, and on behalf of the Center for Narrative and Lyric Arts and our hosts, the Anchorage Museum at Rasmussen Center, thank you for being here today. Gunishish, as we say where I am, down on the icy banks of the Chilkat River in Haines, Alaska. While this reading is free, AQR, like all literary journals, could use your help, so please consider a donation. And now I'd like to introduce Ron Spatz, the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Alaska Quarterly Review. Ron's a professor of English at the University of Alaska, which, by the way, has just about filled up the U.S. Olympic Nordic ski team. But anyway, I'll keep going. We're quite proud here. Ron is a former National Endowment for the Arts Fellow and the recipient of the 2 Alaska Governor's Awards and a Contribution to Literacy Award from the Alaska Center for the Book. And under Ron's over 40 years of leadership and vision, Alaska Quarterly Review has created strong connections between our state and the larger literary community in the US and around the world. And also, as this series has shown us, been very influential in supporting new and emerging writers and giving them a bump into their career, as well as presenting works that include a rigorous questioning of larger societal issues. And there's always a photograph on the cover. Ron?
Thank you, Heather, and welcome everyone. We're deep into 2022, and this event is being recorded and will be available on the Alaska Quarterly Review YouTube channel. Before we begin, I'd like to make a few important acknowledgements. Alaska Quarterly Review acknowledges the Anchorage Museum for hosting and providing technical support for this event, and Web 907 for its web support, and the Center for the Narrative and Lyric Arts, Alaska Quarterly Review's 501c3 umbrella organization, which makes this event possible. I also want to make a land acknowledgement. Alaska Quarterly Review recognizes the indigenous land on which all Alaskans live. AQR is located in Anchorage, and Anchorage is Dena'ina homeland. Dena'ina is the language spoken by the traditional, present, and future caretakers of this land, and land acknowledgement opens a space with gratefulness and respect for the contributions, innovations, and contemporary perspective of Indigenous peoples, and marks our collective movement toward decolonization and equity. And now to begin, Heather Lindy will introduce today's 3 wonderful fiction writers, novelists and short story writers. Heather is the author of 4 books of nonfiction, all published by Algonquin. If you lived here, I'd know your name. Take Good Care of the Garden and the Dogs, Find the Good, and her recently published Of Bears and Ballots. Over to you, Heather.
Thanks, Ron. Oh, I'm looking forward to hearing everybody say. It's really a pleasure to have these 3 women with us. Katherine Heine is the author of Early Morning Rise, Standard Deviation, and Single Carefree Mellow. And her fiction and essays have appeared in the Alaska Quarterly Review, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, Oprah's O magazine, and many other magazines. She lives in Bethesda, Maryland with her husband, a former M16 agent, and children. Forbes has called her a modern Jane Austen and praises her stylistic verve with laugh-out-loud humor as a perfect balance of literary and accessible. She's been compared to Nora Ephron, and with good reason. Heiny says her novel Standard Deviation began as the least satisfying short story ever written, noting, "I truly felt a novel was something I couldn't write, and it was a wonderful surprise to discover that I could. But basically, it's the same process no matter what I'm writing. Me sitting at my desk, stringing words together. Some days I find a rhythm early on and write a lot. Some days I don't, and I'd probably be better off cleaning the refrigerator. But it's all about showing up and at least trying. AQR contributor Anjali Sachdeva's short story collection, All the Names They Used for God, was the winner of the 2019 Chautauqua Prize. It was named a best book of 2018 by NPR, Refinery 21, BookRiot, and many more, actually, and longlisted for the Story Prize. The New York Times Book Review called the collection strange and wonderful. Roxane Gay says every single story is a standout. Her fiction has been published in Fairy Tale Review, McSweeney's Lightspeed, and the Best American Nonrequired Reading, among other publications, and featured on the LeVar Burton Reads podcast. She's the recipient of a creative writing fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts, and she's hiked through the backcountry of Canada, Iceland, Kenya, Mexico, and the US, and spent much of her childhood reading fantasy novels and waiting to be whisked away to an alternate universe. Instead, she lives in Pittsburgh, which she says is pretty wonderful as far as places in this universe go. She teaches at the University of Pittsburgh and the low-residency MFA program at Randolph College. Anjali Sachdeva, who says, I spend a lot of time thinking about the places where everyday life gives way to magic, where science and psychology and history spill over into the inexplicable. Maria Adelman is the author of the short story collection, Girls of a Certain Age. Her work has been published by Alaska Quarterly Review, Tin House, N+1, Electric Literature, Literary Hub, and many others, and has been selected for the Best American Short Stories. She has been honored by the Baker Artist Awards and the Maryland State Arts Council. Also, she has worked variously as a hotel reviewer, product tester, copywriter, and teacher of creative writing. She sailed around the world on semester at sea and at the University of Virginia, where she earned her MFA. She received her BA in English and psychology from Cornell, where she was a Cornell Tradition Fellow. She enjoys learning complicated new crafts and letting art projects take over her life. A longtime resident of Baltimore, she is coming to us today from Copenhagen, where she says, she's actually written for LitHub a pretty funny essay about it, where she got stuck there during the pandemic. Her debut novel, How to Be Eaten, will be published by Little Brown this year, 2022. Maria Adelman, who says, I construct a lot of my stories by asking, what if? What if the thing that I was super worried about had actually happened? And now, since Maria is coming to us from the farthest away, she gets to go first.
Hello, I'm Maria, and I am going to read from my short story collection, Girls of a Certain Age. But I would just plug my novel. This is a galley for it. It's called How to Be Eaten. It's coming out in May, and it's about classic fairy tale characters reimagined as modern American women in group therapy for trauma. So I'm super excited about this. But I'm going to read from Girls of a Certain Age, which is also about modern women, but more realistic. And though many of the stories are from 20 to 30-year-olds, I'm going to actually read the one story one of two stories that's in the voice of a child. And she is a child who is jealous of a friend, as you'll see. So I'll just read the beginning of this story. It's called Pets Are for Rich Kids. I had some sea monkeys once, but they weren't real pets. I ordered them from a catalog where there was this cartoon drawing of them looking like mermaid lizards, naked and pale as macaroni. They were standing on two flippered feet and had spines like roller coasters and crazy tails with paddles at the ends and three antennae that looked like giraffe horns. Bowl full of happiness, said the ad in all caps. Bowl full of bologna, said Ma from the stove where she was sprinkling in the orange powder for the mac and cheese. Why is Ma always right? They weren't even worth the shipping and handling. The sea monkeys were just a bunch of dumb specks, like the dots of eyes that fell out of a book, or like pepper sprinkled on water. I set the stupid plastic aquarium on top of the microwave in the kitchen and forgot all about it. And after a while, all the water was green and kind of fuzzy, and the sea monkeys were all dead. They didn't even care. That's how you know when something isn't worth being alive, if it doesn't care if it's dead. You're being very callous, Ashley, said my friend Willa. We were at her house eating peanut butter cookies off giant napkins. Her dog, Lionel, a yellow lab that Willa yapped about all the time, was licking crumbs up from all around my toes and making me giggle. Willa's kitchen was white and clean, like a hospital. You could probably perform surgery right there on the kitchen table, and at the end, her ma would swoop in and clean the blood up with a miracle mop. Willa was thin and kind of floppy. She could stick her elbow out in the wrong direction, which she called double jointed and I called gross. She always wore fancy barrettes and tops with sequins and glitter, and I always wore t-shirts and black sneakers and my favorite pair of turquoise leggings with a hole in the knee. We were friends for 3 reasons. She was in my class, she lived 3 blocks away, and her mom, Miss Mary, stayed home all day to clean and make snacks. Willa lived in a 2-story red brick house that her family had all to itself. Plus, there was a yard in the back with a fence so you couldn't see the neighbors. Willa had about 1 million pets, a dog and 2 cats, and a turtle named Captain Eric, and a ton of guinea pigs that were always having babies, plus a rock graveyard that took up like a quarter of the yard, where her dad helped her bury all the dead ones. Miss Mary was always wandering around the house with a lint roller, wheeling up fur. Very what? I asked. Callous, said Willa, looking at her fingers and then wiping them on her skirt, like someone who doesn't care about other people. They weren't people. That's the point, I said. They weren't even monkeys. They were dots. Pets are important, said Willa. They teach kids about responsibility. She'd collected a load of crumbs in her napkin and then dumped them all over the floor below the table. Lionel abandoned my feet to go clean up the mess. I made my napkin into a tunnel and poured all the crumbs right into my mouth. Let's go play in the basement, I said. Not yet, said Willa. First, she wanted to tell me all about how she was going to be a pescatarian, which is a vegetarian who doesn't care about fish. I sighed inside myself and started folding my napkin into a cootie catcher. Willa loved to say, not yet, then forced me to listen to all the great things she was doing for animals, like not eating them or adopting them, while I was sitting around waiting to play with her basement toys. Willa's basement had 3 metal shelves full of toys, and you couldn't even get to half of them without a stepladder. The shelves were organized in rows of blue plastic bins with white rectangular labels on them that said what was inside, like Littlest Pet Shop, Polly Pocket, board games, outdoor toys, crafts, Barbies, and American Girl dolls. The only toy that I had that Willa didn't was creepy crawlers, which is like an easy bake oven for bugs. So say you're a pescatarian, I said to Willa, just to see what she'd say. Could you eat Captain Eric? I was opening and closing my cootie catcher with my fingers as fast as I could. A turtle is an amphibian, Ashley, said Willa, shaking her head seriously, like I'd missed some big important lesson in school. You really need a pet, she added. It's like not even right for a kid not to have one. She had little cookie crumbs speckled all around her mouth, and I pictured Miss Mary appearing to lint roll them off. Also, said Willa, I would never kill Captain Eric. You want to know about death, I said, with mystery in my voice. I snapped the cootie catcher shut. Willa shook her head. My dad was climbing Mount Everest, I said, and he just kind of fell off. That's not what my mom said Willa. Who would know better, me or your mom? I asked. I mean, he could have fallen off Mount Everest. That would explain why I hadn't heard from him since he left. I don't know, said Wilma, squirming in her seat. Then when was the funeral? We couldn't find the body, I said. Willa bit the corner of her lip. Let's just go play, she said. Cool, I said, and I hopped off the chair and led us into the basement. A few weeks later, Willa appeared on my stoop, almost toppling over. She was holding a giant cage that covered the entire upper half of her body, so she looked like a robot with a bunch of dangly limbs. The cage had one of those upside-down water bottles in it, plus a guinea pig. She plopped the cage down on the scratchy welcome mat that had been a watermelon before the color came off. I looked over Willa's shoulder into the street, where Miss Mary was smiling and waving at me from her car parked along the curb. Even when something was 3 blocks away, Miss Mary always drove. She drove Willa to the bus stop at the end of the street and around the neighborhood for trick-or-treating, which seemed pretty dumb to me. What's this? I asked. The guinea pig had crammed itself into the corner of the cage. He was white with a few blobs of brown and black that looked like accidents with a paintbrush. He was so fuzzy you couldn't see his face or legs. He reminded me of a giant wad of dust collected under the couch. Willa said that the sea monkeys had made me victims of false advertising. Plus, it was important for kids to have pets. She was happy to give me the opportunity to take care of a pet myself. She told me this with a look on her face I'd seen before at Pioneer Girls, where she won a pink calculator watch for selling the most tins of popcorn, even though her parents just had bought them all. Thanks, I said. There was this weird feeling in my stomach, sort of happy and ill at the same time, like when you're suddenly in the middle of eating too much cake. Or when you're in the middle of eating too much cake. I wanted a pet, but suddenly I wasn't sure how committed I was to learning about responsibility. What are you going to name him? Willa asked. Tiger, I said. Willa didn't even crack a smile. That's condescending, she said. How would you feel if your parents named you like Dog or something? I'd feel fine, I said, better than a name like Willa. She looked down at the guinea pig, like maybe she better take it back. This is just one pet, Ashley, she said finally. Try and keep it alive. When Ma got home from work, she saw the guinea pig and said, Jesus Christ. Then she sighed real big and draped her blue Rite Aid vest over the back of the rocking chair and plopped down on the orange-red couch and turned on the 6 o'clock news so she could be up to date with what was happening in the world. We'd flipped the cushions because one side was all ratty, and now they were darker than the rest of the couch, and also the arms were sunken in like Ma's cheeks because of her missing side teeth. Ma said I was going to return the guinea pig to Willa, but I banged all around the apartment in a rage and stomped back and forth in front of Peter Jennings, saying that it was important for kids to learn responsibility. She told me to be quiet or we'd get a call from Mr. S in the basement apartment. Ma was in a real mood ever since Don left, but I wasn't too distraught because he finally sent me a postcard, a picture of a milkshake stand in the middle of a desert landscape. The stand was called Desert Dessert. On the back, he wrote in giant capital letters, had a milkshake here and thought of you. I swear there was nothing else for miles. Yours, Daddy. It wasn't a lot of information, but I loved mail and also milkshakes. Life at home didn't seem all that different without him. When he was around, he was mostly at work. Ma looked away from the news to stare me in the eyes and say, I'm not lifting one finger to take care of it, just so you know, not one finger. It was a promise she kept. Tiger was a real pain. He was eating all my money and also pooping on it. I had to clean his cage every week or else it would stink to high heaven, so I would always be walking down to the pet shop on Glenmont to buy wood chips. The pet shop was squeezed between an alcohol store and a cafe with no name that made the whole block smell like bacon and coffee. I tried to get Willa to walk down there with me once, but she said she wasn't allowed, which made me feel a little haughty, which is like with your nose in the air. Then again, maybe Will didn't want to go because she didn't need to, because her parents always drove her to the big pet store because she never paid for anything herself, not the wood chips or the dog food or the little treasure boxes that popped open and closed in Captain Eric's cage or tank. Alex with a K owned the pet store, and he had a green parrot who flew around the place. And if you sneezed, the parrot would sneeze too, and Alex would say, wait till you'll see what it does when you fart. One time when I was in a bad mood, my dad and I walked over to the pet store and he asked Alex if I could play with the rabbit, and Alex let me, but that was a long time ago. Even though Alex would sometimes give me a 10% discount for being a loyal customer, I still started to worry I'd run out of resources, especially when I heard Ma on the phone talking about how we didn't have any money left. I heard this sometimes when I'd sneak out of my room for a midnight snack and Ma would be sitting at the kitchen table in her thin black nightie and pink robe, twisted in the telephone cord like some spider had wound her up there and would have her for dinner later. She'd be saying stuff like, he's hardly sent a dime, and men are bastards, and men are animals, and men suck you dry. But later I'd scrub out the yellow tub with comment or something and she'd give me another $1. I tried to make Tiger run through a maze of VHS tapes, but he'd just lay around on the rug like a lump. I put a trail of food pellets through the maze, but Tiger still wouldn't move, even when I poked him in the butt over and over, saying, lazy bones. Finally, I just took one of the tapes out of the maze and popped it in the VCR and forgot to put him in his cage. And later I found a bunch of poop under the couch, plus him asleep in a ball. Even though I didn't really like Tiger, I was also worried that he'd die, which is what made him worse than the sea monkeys. I'd rush home from school to look into his cage. He was usually sleeping, curled up like a giant dirty cotton ball on top of his own poop. He was so fluffy you couldn't tell he was breathing, so just to make sure he was alive, I'd tilt the cage up and Tiger would wake up in a panic and scramble down the ramp to the side that was still on the floor. And I'd feel bad for waking him, even though all he ever did was sleep. One day I tipped the cage and Tiger didn't scramble. He just rolled all the way down the wood chips covered in his poop and hit the other end of the cage with a thud. I was mad, but also relieved because now I could stop wondering if he was dead. Since we didn't have a yard, Ma and I walked to the park with Tiger in a key food bag. Ma was beautiful with some meat on her bones and a little darkness under her eyes like a rainy day, and a chin that was pointed always a little toward the sky despite everything. She often wore these little blue dangly earrings that matched her Rite Aid vest, and she was wearing them as we walked the park to the edge of the woods, and they twinkled in the sun like they were expensive. We rolled Tiger up in a big green maple leaf, and Ma said, would you like to say a few words? She put her hand on my shoulder as I held Tiger like a burrito. Tiger, I said, You weren't that fun and you're expensive, but I'm sorry that you're dead. I was sorry, but it seemed like if a thing had to leave, it was better if it died. Then you didn't have to wonder if it might come back. Otherwise, you're left feeling like you do when you have to return a chapter book to the library before you finish reading it. Amen, said Ma, and we agreed that she would do the honors of pitching him into the woods because she had a great arm. When Willa heard about this, she clutched her puffy hair and screamed, "You did what?" We were at her house and hadn't even gotten to the cookies yet. He was eating me out of house and home, I said. Did you kill him? She said, her eyes welling up with tears so they glittered like her stupid sparkly shirt. Did you do it on purpose? Are you kidding me? I said, I did everything for that bastard. And how does he thank me? Will stared at me hard because Tiger was dead and I'd said a swear word, which get over it. And then Will's dad, Mr. Tim, came in the door whistling and carrying a big bag of dog food in his arm. Everything all right in here? He asked. Willa didn't even look at him. Seriously, Dad, she said, like it was none of his beeswax. When he left the room, she whispered, you're so irresponsible, you can't even keep a rodent alive. Then when he's dead, you can't even bury him, right? What did you want me to do? Bury it in a flower pot? I asked. It, Willa screamed, it. Then she stopped talking to me and I went home without a cookie or a chance to play with her basement toys. And I'll stop there. And I just want to say at the end here, thank you to Alaska Quarterly Review and also the Anchorage Museum and Ron and Heather. And that's it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. That was just delightful. I'm glad you picked that one. And I'm trying to figure out, I don't even remember now who was next, which is, you got me so distracted. I was like, oh, anyway, wonderful story. Thank you. And Anjali is reading for us next. So now we're going from Copenhagen to Pittsburgh.
Pittsburgh, yes. Thank you so much, Heather, and thank you, Ron, as well. So I'm going to tonight read one of my newer stories, but before I started, I did want to say that the story I published in Alaska Quarterly Review was one of my not my first published story, but one of my first, and it was the first story that I wrote that I did end up including in my collection. So in that way, I think of it as like the first, I don't know, really finished piece that I wrote. And it was a story about a mermaid, and the mermaid's tail ended up being the cover of the paperback edition. So I still have the email you sent me, Ron, when it was accepted, and I was looking at it tonight, and it was still exciting to read it even 12 years later. So thank you again. The piece I'm going to read from tonight is a very long short story, and I'm just going to read 2 excerpts from it. It is in Lightspeed magazine, and it is a piece that I started writing about 5 years ago that then unfortunately became very timely. So I am going to read from that. It is called The Incorruptible World. And I will start at the beginning and then I'll fill in a little bit in the middle and read a second scene. That first autumn, it felt as if the whole world had been made for them, which of course it had. They walked down the avenue of oaks that reached above their heads like Gothic arches, red leaves drifting lazily down to collect at their feet. Ashwin was pleased as anything and couldn't say enough about the designers, how it was worth spending more sometimes, how you got what you paid for. Everything was just as he'd imagined it. Roseate light, unseasonal butterflies, crisp air with a faint waft of frost in it. To Jade, the place was beautiful without having any special charm. She knew she could have seen the same landscape in a vidroom down the street from their apartment, could have had the scent of fog and bonfires pumped in and controlled the temperature from her cuff. But Ash was always a fanatic for authenticity. He didn't care if the trees looked real if you couldn't reach out and touch them, crumble the dry leaves in your fingers, scrape your shoulder on their bark with a careless stumble. The planet was small, about 16 kilometers in diameter. Watching from the ship as they slowed for landing, Jade found the way the horizon curled across the little freshwater ocean unsettling. The ocean took up about a third of the planet, blank canvas for later expansion if they wanted it, Ash said. and the land was divided into 3 sections: grassland, deciduous forest, and tropical jungle with a strip of white sand beach. At their nexus were 4 city blocks. The city had been Jade's idea. Nature is not to everyone's taste, you know, she said, and we might want to have guests someday. She had designed the city herself, and so it was a hodgepodge of the megacities she loved, part Omaha, part Shenzhen, with traces of Mombasa and McMurdo'sburg and Oslo. In the middle, a single building rose up 20 stories into the air like an obelisk, and from the top floor, you could see much of the rest of the world. The city was Jade's only contribution to the whole enterprise. When she and Ashwin had gotten engaged and Ash had decided to purchase the planet as a honeymoon escape, he had asked her to come with him to meet the designers, ostensibly so she could give her input. But it was quickly clear that in this, as in all other aspects of his life, Ash had very specific ideas about what he wanted, and she was mostly there to witness. It didn't matter. The whole thing seemed like a very involved pet project, and she was just as happy to let him make the decisions while she dealt with the more practical aspects of their future together, arranging for their partnership paperwork and giving notice at her job. Even with the prenup, she'd never have to earn an hourly wage again. When she arrived at the Orbscapers offices for the main design meeting, Ash was already there, poring over maps and artists' renderings of the proposed terrain. As Jade entered the room, she was struck, as she often was, by how handsome Ash was in spite of his strange looks. Among his obsessions was a horror of physical reconstitution, and while he didn't complain about her treatments, he himself refused all but the most basic procedures. He had let his hair turn silver, and his dark brown skin was creased and lined. She found it charming. She saw him every day, and yet she could always find something different in his face. As she approached the table, the designer stood up and bowed. "I'm Maddock," he said, pulling a chair up to the table for her. The office was done in a style that seemed tailored for Ash's interests, all polished stone and biofabric, with a sheet of water running down one wall. Ash glanced up and reached for her hand, which she gave him. "We're looking at customizations," he said. "I'm thinking a temperature range of 20 to 25, maybe some seasonal changes. It would be fun to have seasons, wouldn't it? Do we need rain?" "Not strictly, no," said Maddock. "The plants need to be watered somehow, of course, but we can use low moisture plants, which will be fine with a couple of days of rain each month. Or we can set it to rain at night and then do a quick burst of heat in the early mornings to dry things out before you start your day. Some people find that really peaceful. Rain on the roof was actually a favorite sound back in the era of single-family dwellings. But if you prefer, we can also just install subterranean irrigation, although that's an additional cost." Ash looked at Jade, eyebrows raised. "Rain at night sounds fine," she said. "We're not going to be outdoors at 4 a.m, I don't think." "We could also install a manual override," said Maddock. "If, for example, you had a night or two that you wanted to be out late, you could just shut it off for that night and it would automatically resume the next day." Ash nodded. "That sounds perfect," he said, but he looked distracted. He was thinking of something, judging by the way he kept pursing his lips, as if words were trying to creep out of his mouth. Maddox seemed to sense it too, because he muted his screen and turned to look at them. "There really are a lot of different customizing options available," he said, "and we're adding new ones all the time. Did you have anything particular in mind?" Ash toyed with one of the sleek black pebbles that had been scattered on the table for decoration. "Is it possible for the planet to be sterile?" he said. Jade looked away and closed her eyes for a moment. He couldn't help himself, she knew. "Do you mean the plants?" Maddox said, "seedless?" "No, not sexually sterile. I just mean clean, germless. The whole planet and everything in it." "Oh," said Maddox. "Well, we haven't done it before, but, well, I'd have to look into the specs for that. It would certainly be very expensive," said Ashwin, speaking the word with the relish of someone with a vast supply of funds. So I'm going to skip ahead a little here, but we learn that this character, Ashwin, is intensely germophobic. And so he does have this entire planet built to be completely germless and customized so that no viruses, bacteria of any kind can get into it. And the designers use these little microscopic nano machines to replace some of the functions that bacteria serve within the body. Because as much as we are all freaked out by germs right now, we actually can't live without viruses and bacteria in our body for very long at all. So the Ash and Jade get married. They head off to this planet for their honeymoon. And Ash especially is having a wonderful time because he's never been in a place with no germs. And his phobia of germs has really limited his life experiences up to this point. And then on the last day of their trip, the ship that is supposed to arrive and takes them home just never shows up. And they try all these various things to contact it, but they are essentially stuck in this very beautiful but very isolated planet far from Earth. Months and months go by and they start to think about their long-term survival. They have a machine called an aggregator that makes their food for them, but they decide they're going to learn, Jade is going to learn how to hunt some of the animals that live around them. So she starts doing that. And at the point where I'm going to pick the story back up, they've actually been marooned on this planet for 6 years. And they have accepted that no one is ever going to come and get them. So that is where I'm going to start. And Jade has just hunted and killed a gazelle, and they've had it for dinner. It was a few nights after she killed the gazelle that Ash's stomach began to hurt, and at first she blamed the meat. Maybe she'd taken too long to butcher it and it had turned. Impossible, remember, Ash said. There's no bacteria to make it go bad. Well, maybe you're just allergic then. I probably just ate too much. I'm sure I'll feel better tomorrow. But he didn't. He was plagued by constant stomach cramps, nausea, diarrhea. He began to lose weight. No more hunted food, Jade said, though she'd eaten it too and felt just fine. Strictly aggregator meals until you're better. But months passed and Ash wasn't better, or at least not much. Even on days when he wasn't sick, he had a constant low-level stomach upset that killed his appetite. Even without reconstitution treatments, he'd always seemed younger than his 50 years, but now he looked his age and then older. He rarely worked on his projects anymore, spent much of the day just sitting on the veranda of whatever home they happened to be in, looking out at the world he had ordered. Jade found herself taking longer and longer walks, ranging across the different biomes and the seams between them, trying to smother her restlessness. One day she came home to the forest house, their current haunt, and found him lying on the patio, his body turned away from her, a small gray and brown bird perched placidly on his shoulder. The bird took flight as she ran up to him, and she turned Ash onto his back. He smiled up at her and she caught her breath. What happens when we break, Jade, he said. There's no one here to fix us, that's for certain. It's beyond my skill and probably beyond yours too, though I admit you have surprised me with what you've been able to do. We have to try, she said. What could it hurt to try? I think it's the nanites, he said, the ones we used to replace the gut bacteria. They were only meant to last a few months. They've done much better than that, you have to admit, but mine aren't working anymore and yours will probably give out too. Bit of a joke, really. I can't tell you how many times in my childhood I could have died from a bacterial illness or an infected wound. I always made it through and I took the opportunity to build a path right to this place, clean to death. There's got to be something we could use to replace it, she said, in the animals or the dirt. There isn't. Trust me, I saw the bills, no expense spared. It's the very definition of this place. Ash wanted to sleep outside after that, to be outside all the time, and how could she say no? There was no reason not to. No mosquitoes, no predators, no unexpected weather. The roof of the porch kept off the rain and sun. Ash grew weaker by the day, but was content. Often he would ask her to bring him something, a shell, a stone, a branch in bud, and would spend hours running his fingers along the contours of it. It's a king's world after all, he told her. You couldn't buy this kind of quiet at home. You couldn't find this much unspoiled land. Jade helped herself to a cigarette and did not answer. The quiet was very much on her mind. She knew how quiet it would be once he was gone. He slipped from her in such incremental degrees, sleeping most of each day, dipping in and out of lucidity, that she began to think his death would be unremarkable. But when she finally woke in the middle of the night and found he was not breathing, Jade felt herself squeezed by a compressive panic that caught her off guard. She shook Ash's frail shoulders as though he were only playing a joke on her, and then, without a clear thought in her head, got to her feet and walked out into the forest. The dead leaves of 6 years surrounded her, more than 70 autumns gone by on the forest's monthly cycle, the world designed for a cleanup that never came. She and Ash had cleared paths, the leaves heaped into drifts that nearly reached the branches of the trees they came from, but there was no real relief. She reached to her pocket for her cigarettes, pulled out the silver case and the lighter, flicked a flame to life and stood staring at it. Let it all go to hell and go with it, she thought. What's left for you? She touched the lighter to the nearest pile of dry leaves. A line of gold ran along the leaf's edge, a small orange and blue flame licking along its surface. There was a minute where everything was silent and slow, the flame wending its way from one leaf to the next, the soft gray scent of burning rising to her face. And then things happened very fast. The pile of leaves caught quickly and the flames seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the air. They jumped, reaching for the branches above them, and Jade stepped backward. Already a cloud of black smoke was pouring from the leaf pile, and the next pile had caught flame, and soon another. Around her, she could hear rustlings in the leaves, the panicked sound of animals taking flight. She too turned and ran, but unlike them, she knew better. Ultimately, there was no escape. The fire would burn until it reached the ocean, until it had reduced the whole habitable world to ash. Stupid girl, she thought. Stupid way to find out you don't really want to die. Something landed on her nose. A moment later, on the back of her neck, her arms, her legs. She swiped at her body, imagining sparks, but realized she wasn't burned. Jade looked up through the branches and leaves and saw the pale outlines of clouds against the stars. The 4 a.m. rain right on time. She ran on as the storm gathered intensity, soaking her, subduing the piles of leaves to a slow burn and then a sizzle. She reached the house and sat by Ash's still body, one hand resting lightly on his forehead until the sun came up. And I am going to stop there. Thank you again for having me today.
Thank you, Anjali. That's remarkable. Thank you. Kind of took my breath away. And Katherine.
Thank you. I just want to start out and say that earlier in my book tour, I did a split screen event like this, and one of the other authors had just had her book optioned by Netflix. And if you go back and watch the video on YouTube, when she starts talking about her Netflix deal, my face looks really unpleasant, really jealous. And so if I look super happy at some moment, it's just because I'm remembering that, because it really was very funny. But on a more serious level, it's exciting for me to be doing this reading because the Alaska Quarterly Review published a story of mine in 2014. And that story went on to become the second chapter of my book, Early Morning Riser. But when I wrote the story, I didn't know it was going to be anything more than just a story. And writing a novel is such an incredibly long haul that it feels like people are helping you along the way. And I definitely felt like the Alaska Quarterly Review was early help and really set me on the way. So sort of a Lion King circle of life for my book. And the book is about a woman who moves to a small town in Michigan and falls for the local woodworker who's very much the local Lothario also. And the town that she moves to is called Boyne City, and it's a town in Michigan. And my husband and I had a summer house there for almost 20 years. And Boyne City has the most beautiful beaches and the most beautiful sunsets. And it's a very small town with the like pluses and minuses of that. And I remember when we first moved there, we didn't have Wi-Fi in the house. So I used to go over to my neighbor's house at night and stand on the edge of his property and hook onto his Wi-Fi with my phone and check my email. And after like 3 days of this, the other neighbors were like, why are you going over to Ralph's house in your nightgown every night at 10? And I was like, oh, it's a small town. They're all watching me. But also my sons really grew up there in the summers, and they both took their first steps there. The younger one in a bar, although it was more wholesome than it sounds. And they learned to ride bikes there, and they had their first summer jobs there. And when my older son went to interview at the pizza place for his summer job, they asked him how fast he was on a scale of 1 to 10. And he was like, ooh, a 5, maybe a 5.5. And they still hired him. And that to me is like the beauty of Boyne City distilled into one incident. And I first tried to write a novel there about a brother and sister who hire a man to get in a driving accident with their elderly mother because they want her to stop driving. And that novel didn't work, but the man that they hired was Duncan, the local Lothario. And I really liked him, so I kept him and started over. And I knew I wanted to tell it from the story of the new woman in Duncan's life who would have to deal with this like legion of former girlfriends. So just when I was starting that, my son's teacher, he was in 2nd grade, told me that they apparently lived next to a house that was growing and selling marijuana. And the DEA came to kick down the door of the house next door to them, but they got the address wrong. So they kicked down my son's teacher's house. And she was at school and her husband was a teacher at school. So they both got called home to deal with their broken front door and the sort of angry DEA agents. And it was pajama day. So they had to go do that in their pajamas. And that struck me as like the greatest story anybody could possibly ever have. So right on the spot, I decided that the main character in my novel would be a 2nd grade teacher. So with all that backstory, the section I'm going to read is about when Jane has parent-teacher conferences for the first time at her new school. In mid-November, Jane had parent-teacher conferences. And even though most of the parents of her students were concerned and loving and valued education, she was still anxious. All parents want to hear good things about their children, but sometimes you had to say bad things. If you said the bad things too subtly, the parents didn't believe you. If you said the bad things too plainly, the parents got upset. Actually, they often didn't believe you anyway, and then they got upset too. It was like having an intervention for an alcoholic every 20 minutes for an entire working day. Duncan spent the whole of that day at school with Jane. He came to her classroom between every conference and massaged her shoulders. For lunch, he bought her a sandwich with sliced turkey 2 inches thick and a bunch of daisies. He fixed the squeak on her swivel chair and reattached the whiteboard tray to the wall and stood on Jane's desk and used the pointer to retrieve a banana from on top of the lights where someone had thrown it. Another stressful element of parent-teacher conferences was that sometimes Jane got a little insight into her student's life that she'd rather not have. Like when Crystal Orr's father asked what grade this was, and when Jane told him 2nd grade, he'd said, wow, Crystal's in 2nd already? Or when Seth Dorsey's mother asked what would happen if, hypothetically, a parent did a student's math homework. Jane told her that the parents who did their children's homework were preventing their children from learning. What would happen though, Seth's mother asked. Jane said if it became a regular thing, she would have to involve the principal. What if you couldn't prove it though? Seth's mother continued. What if the child denied it? Brianna Wooten's mother let the class hamster out of its cage without asking and spent almost the entire conference dashing around the classroom calling, "Cuthbert, Cuthbert, I need you to listen." Jane only had a minute there at the end to tell her that she thought Brianna might have some attention deficit issues. And Kenny Parrish's father told her indignantly that Kenny could definitely read at a second grade level because he could tell the difference between Foster's Lager and Foster's Special Bitter when asked to fetch one from the fridge. After the last conference, Duncan brought Jane her own beer from the cooler in his van and held her feet on his lap and gave her a foot rub, massaging her insteps with hard, smooth strokes. It was actually better than sex in a way, because really, how often do you sit around thinking, I'm so tired, I wish someone would have sex with me? All the time, Duncan said when Jane told him this. I literally think that all the time. And so they did that too, right there in the classroom, with the door shut and the lights off. For weeks after, Jane felt horribly guilty whenever she looked at the Peter Rabbit rug. So I'm going to stop there. But thank you very much. I can't believe I'm the only one that read about sex.
Oh, thank you. Thank all of you. That was great. And the one thing there's many things that we could talk about, and you could really talk about anything you'd like. But one thing that I was thinking of, listening to all of you in your introductions a little bit, and then reading some of the things that you've said in different interviews, is that you all write beautifully, and have published beautiful books, and yet each of you talks about the difficulties of writing finishing the novel, getting to the novel and doing that. And I'm wondering if maybe you could talk about that a little bit, because when you hear you just think, oh, it must be easy to do this. What are some of the hurdles? I think it was Anjali that said something that I read in an interview about giving a writer what's the worst advice you could give a writer, and it was something along the lines that, or maybe it was Katherine said this. I forget which one of you when I was looking around, but it said the worst advice you could give a writer is that don't worry, just go ahead and do it next year. You'll have more time. I don't know. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit. How the three of you work, and how you tackle something like a long piece of fiction, and obviously successfully. You can just jump in. If you don't want to talk about that, you don't have to either.
I'll jump in on that one. So, I always tell people, I think there's like the best way to write, and then there's the thing you can get done. So I've heard from so many writers who advocate, that you have your set time in the morning, and like you just sit and you write for an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours or 5 hours or whatever. And at the same time every day in the same place. But I don't know, my life just doesn't function that way. So I just write in kind of binges. I have a writing group that I really adore. And we all exchange work, and knowing that those people are going to read my work and it has to be done, it just always gives me that extra push to get it done. So I have days when I write 8 hours, and I have days when I write not at all. And that is just what has worked for me.
I would agree with that. And I also think that it's important to realize that when you're starting a story or a novel, it's like a train, and it moves very slowly while you figure it out. And then the second half of it tends to move much more quickly, and like a train, and it picks up speed. And I wish I had known that when I first started writing, because when you're starting, it seems so hard. And then by the end of the book, like at the end of Early Morning Riser, there was a line that a character said that was slightly ungrammatical, and the copy editors kept flagging it. And I was like, but Aggie said that. I heard her say it. I know she said it, but finally I changed it anyway. But it does seem near the very end, you get this sort of creative burst where it feels like the characters are talking and you just have to write it down.
I'll say for me, the novel was very hard because I had really hadn't had aspirations of writing a novel. I liked short stories and that was what I wanted to do, but for various reasons had to write a novel. And I thought it was kind of ludicrous that someone would ask me to. It was such a different animal. I feel like it's like if you ask the poet, like, oh, what, like write a short story next. It just seemed like there was no way. There was a way, but I think it took me a long time because I was very much stuck in the short story mindset. And I think you do have to sort of tackle it differently than a short story. I feel like you don't, I feel like I could have done more planning the first time around on the novel, which I feel like I don't have to do as much with the short story collection because I can sort of find the story as I go and then throw it out and start again. There's like a little more time for that. So that was my challenge.
So Maria, what's the difference between a short story mindset versus a novel mindset? I mean, when you go to, you just don't begin the same way and just keep going and then just end one earlier and end one later?
Yeah, that's a great question. There, I forget who said this, but there's a quote that is a short story, a novel can win but with points. It was a comparison to boxing, but a short story has to win with a knockout. And I think that is one of the big differences. There's an accumulation that is available to you in a novel that is not available to you in a short story. And there's an accumulation that's necessary in a novel that that you don't even want in a short story. So it's, yeah, I think that's one of the big differences.
And Katherine, you were talking about that, you know, by the time you get to the end, your characters are speaking to you. And that just sounds like so magical when that happens. It must make you just go, like I'm a writer. My instincts were right. I mean, does it always happen? Does it take a while longer than shorter? I mean, how do you think you get to that point?
I think, well, you said it sounds like magical. I think it sounds totally crazy, but it does happen. And there was a scene at the end of Early Morning Riser where Jane's mother tells Duncan in detail about her menopause. And I remember writing that late at night, which I hardly ever write late at night, but I was trying to finish the novel. And then I went upstairs and said to my husband, like, you won't believe what Jane's mother just said. It was really, really funny. So I think is it trial lawyers that say it's like 95% preparation and 5% inspiration? I think the novel, you're really in those early chapters, you're laying the groundwork, you're figuring it all out. And my first novel I wrote without an outline, and like Maria, and the second one I outlined, and I strongly recommend the outlining rather than the free form. But yeah, I think when you get to that point where it feels like everything's coming together and everything's very real, I guess it is very magical.
I recently listened to an interview with Ann Tyler, and she said that when it's time for her to start a new novel, which sort of happens when she's feeling antsy or needs, you know, it's a sort of a cycle with her. And she said that she gives it 30 days. She goes to her desk every day for 30 days and just tries to come up with ideas. And she said about day 28, she's pretty sure she doesn't have another novel in her. And then sure enough, on day 30, bingo, she sees a person and she goes, you know, the character steps in and she's like, wonder what he does next. And she goes from there. Now, maybe she has an outline too once she starts that first part. But I see, Anjali, you're nodding your head about some of this. What?
No, I'm just hoping that like I could do that, and then in 30 days I would know what I was doing.
Well, it's hopeful though to think that maybe, that it might take that long.
Yes, yeah.
I have one question. What about humor? Because today's reading, two of the three of you, I mean, would have been drowned out by the laughter. How do you employ that? Because it's important in your work.
Well,
Oh, go ahead.
no, you have the spotlight. You go.
I'll just say that it comes naturally to me, and I think that I can't help myself when I try to be very serious and not be funny. It just reads super flat. It's not my voice. It's inauthentic. So I think I learned that that's just part of what makes my writing, and so I have to lean into that a little bit.
I was going to say that I think I'm just very insecure, and I can never believe people are going to read what I've written unless there are a lot of jokes in it. And also, when I look back, a lot of books have changed my life, but a lot of Ann Tyler books, a lot of Stephen King books. But when I look back on like High Fidelity by Nick Hornby, or Bridget Jones's Diary by Helen Fielding, or Heartburn by Nora Ephron, those a really great comic novel, I just feel like is one of life's great pleasures. So that would be what I try to make. I think that's my motivation.
And Anjali, I mean, you're known for more serious, but it's funny too, though. Your characterizations of people. I mean, you just killed the gazelle. Like, that's there's funny in those in your stories. They're dark sometimes and kind of weird, but there's like normal people in the middle doing things that are right in the middle of like this fantastical thing, and with their metal hands doing like normal stuff, and it's just it's kind of dislocating sometimes.
Yes, I would say definitely when I bring in, I do bring in humor into some of my stories, but it is usually a dark humor, which also is what I like to read. I like to see something that it turns so dark that you kind of have to laugh at it.
Well, I really want to thank all of you today. What a great reading, to laugh and think, and just to be in the presence of just some terrific women too. So good. Thank you very much for joining us today. And the other thing I want to say before we leave here, find my notes that I have now disappeared off the page, is one of the best ways that you can support these writers is to buy their books. And hopefully you can do it at your local independent bookstore, which is, hand selling their books, and you can share them with your friends. Also, there a couple of them at least are available on audiobook, and that's another fun way to get to know writers. And another way, of course, is to support literary journals like Alaska Quarterly Review. Get a subscription, get one for a friend, or you can donate as part of this series. It's easy. You can find the button there on your screen. And I want to again thank the terrific writers that we've had today for sharing their stories and for sharing their books with the world. And thank once again Cody Carver at the Anchorage Museum at the Rasmussen Center, and look forward to our next talk. And now, as always, Ron, you've got the last word.
Thank you, Heather. And again, a sincere thank you, Anjali, Katherine, and Maria. And Maria, for starting at 2 a.m. in the morning to do this is really, really amazing. And your support of AQR over the years is so much appreciated. I believe it's made a big difference. So thank you. Coming up for us in February, we have 3 events, 2 poetry events, one on the 11th of February and the other on the 16th. 16th is actually going to be on a Wednesday. All of our other events are Friday evenings. Wednesday, we have a very special event with Jane Hirschfield and Dorianne Locks. They're going to have a conversation about their poetry, and it's called Facts into Poems. And on February 28th, 5th, we have a group of 3 fiction writers again. So with that, thank you, Heather Lindy, for your amazing service to this cause, Anchorage Museum. And again, Maria, Anjali, and Katherine, so very much appreciated. So until the next time, bye, everybody. Hope to see everybody back and watching